So we have an exciting topic to talk about tonight. I'm going to do a screen share here so that everybody can take a look at this week's amazing Parsha. And what is so neat here is that this week's Parsha has everything to do with what's going on today. Everything to do with what's going on today. So can everybody see Shemot chapter 1? Does everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, everybody see it. Wonderful. Okay, so for those of you who are new to the class, feel free to keep yourself muted during the class so we don't hear your toilets flushing and your phone calls and all the other fun things that are going on. And whenever you want to interject, feel free to pop in, and we'd love to hear your comments. So just make sure that you've got that red microphone on your bottom left corner, and then just feel free to unmute yourself whenever you want. So I want to share with you, so obviously I don't need to rehash what happened today. I think everybody was following it, what happened with the storming of the Capitol today by supporters of the president who were not happy, obviously, with today's proceedings in the Senate to move on to the transition of power to Joe Biden. And the pretty terrible scene erupted where Americans essentially stopped democracy from functioning. So I think it's a sad day in our history that this happened. And I've spoken with many people today, both on the political right and on the political left. As you know, I never speak politics, and so I'm going to keep to that tonight as well. We want everybody to feel comfortable. But the reason that I think I can say what I just said is I don't think that's political. I don't think that saying that people taking over and stopping the government from functioning should be even construed in any which way as a political statement. I think any people of good conscience from the right or the left should agree to that. And I think in general they do. That being said, there's a whole, people were calling me today saying, well, and this is where you get into the nitty gritty. I've had a person who called who is a very, very strong conservative person calling and arguing, why are all the liberals upset? They've been rioting for the last 4 years. We do one riot and this is what we get. Well, okay, it's a discussion to have. I don't think it's a fair comparison. And that's what I spoke about with this lady, which is it's fair to talk about if there have been crimes on both sides, which there certainly have been over the last 4 years. But I do think that this is a different level where you actually go and stop democracy from functioning. And then, of course, you have cries from the left and you have cries from the center. Today was not a good day. I think most people agree to that, regardless of where you stand. But here's the interesting part. It leads us to a fascinating discussion of what should our relationship be with the government. So if you are a Trump supporter who feels that you have been robbed and that the election has been stolen from you, do you have a right, a moral right, or maybe even a moral obligation? And again, I'm not saying that I agree to this at all. I don't. But it's an interesting thought experiment. What is our relationship to a government if we believe that they're doing something wrong? So here's the thing that's important to recognize. The people who stormed the government today did not think of themselves as villains. They thought of themselves as heroes and patriots. And it's important to recognize that. You can think of them however you want to, but understand that it's important to see what they thought of themselves. We've spoken about this in the past, that Hollywood has done such a great disservice to mankind because it always puts the heroes are always good looking, princes, princesses, they've got great bodies and very handsome and pretty. And the villains are always dressed in black. They've always got some mean cat. I'm just thinking of the Smurf show right now, Gargamel, or whatever his name was. And they look evil. They have an evil snicker. But that's not the reality. The reality is that villains look just like us, and so do heroes. And so Hitler thought of himself as the great redeemer of Europe. Hitler was Mr. Terminex, getting rid of the vermin. Now we know what an atrocity it was, but in his eyes, the same way that we get excited when Terminex comes to our house and cleans up our house and stops the ants from getting in. Well, that's that. Hitler saw himself as Mr. Terminex. So, It's important to recognize that the people today that stormed the Capitol saw themselves as patriots and heroes. And the question that we have to ask is, okay, well, we may disagree with their philosophy. And certainly I would hope, even if you do agree with their philosophy, you disagree with their deeds. But nevertheless, what are your thoughts about civil disobedience? Is there a place for civil disobedience? Is there even sometimes a moral obligation to be disobedient? So before we even get to our Parsha, what are your thoughts on this? Is there a place for civil disobedience?
We read earlier this year, or I guess it was last year, some statement about always sort of supporting the government because I think it was something like chaos was much worse. There was wasn't there a quote that we gave that always support your government no matter what? And that's even when the Romans were in place.
Yeah, so that's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that we studied together that says, if not for the fear of government, man would eat man alive.
We saw that today.
We saw that today. That's right. So without law and order, so to speak, people would fall to their deepest bad inclinations and instincts. And what that says is that anarchy is not good. But there's a difference between saying government is good versus all government is good. Do you agree to that difference? Meaning we need government to create law and order, but that statement that anarchy is not good does not by any means imply that all governments are equally good or that there are times where we have to stand against our governments. Would you agree to that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a big protest going on in Hong Kong, for example, for probably the right reason. And they are validly protesting in Hong Kong while this is going on right now in America.
Right. Now, by the way, I do want to draw somewhat of a distinction, though. Now, it could be in Hong Kong, even the right to assemble. I don't know even if they have that right. Do they have the right to assemble in Hong Kong? Anybody know? Or is it illegal?
Not anymore, probably.
Probably illegal. But I guess our question is a little different. We're not just talking about protesting, which technically, let's say, at least in America, you have the right to assemble. But we're talking about going directly against the government. The government says, this is the law, and you say, I'm not going to follow the law because I think that law is bad. Or we are going to stop the government from doing whatever they want to do because we think that this government is evil. So that's even more than just protesting. I'm going against it. Is there a time and place for that?
Well, obviously. I mean, look at Germany or the French Revolution or any other, or American Revolution. And yet, but doesn't it go back to, our basics, the 10 Commandments, and we have halachic information telling us, don't we? What's right and what's wrong, and we have to abide by the higher moral authority, even though we're supposed to follow the laws of the land. But we follow the laws of the land up until they cross boundaries between what Hashem says is morally right.
All right, so that's a great comment, Leah. Thank you for unmiking yourself and giving us that great comment. Absolutely. But I want you to recognize, and this is what I want to explain in this class, that which you just explained, that there is different tiers of authority, that government is one tier of authority, and there's a mitzvah, a rabbinic mitzvah, which is called the law of the land is the law. And my father, who's with us here, will know that my grandfather constantly informs us of this great mitzvah, which is in his eyes the 11th of the 10 Commandments. The law of the land is the law. Am I right, Abba? I think that is, we can't hear you, but.
Dina de Malchuta Dina.
Would you agree that Saba would say that's the 11th commandment?
That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but he likes to say it a lot.
Okay, he says it a lot. He is an accountant, and he does not like people who are, what's that? What'd you say?
And a lawyer.
And he's a lawyer?
Yes, you didn't know that? Yes.
I didn't know that. He's been doing my taxes for free for many years. That's all I know. Up until recently, we recently gave him a pass. The last 2 years, I'm sure it's been very sad for him. He's always told me, I need more puppet clients like you. So anyways, this to my grandfather is one of the holy grail of Jewish law. The law of the land is the law. And he says this because he's seen many people who are otherwise religious acting a little shady when it comes to cheating on taxes and things like that. And he would remind us, it's not only a civil obligation, but it is a religious obligation to follow the laws of the land. But then Leah, you come and you say, well, wait a minute, this rabbinic law that the law of the land is the law, meaning even halachically, even Jewishly, is there a point where that's not true? What if the law of the land violates the Torah? Let's say the law of the land says you cannot keep kosher. You cannot keep Shabbat. By the way, lest you think that I'm talking about some bygone day, I don't know if you know this, but just now the European Union outlawed Shlita. For those of you who do not know that, actually, was it the European Union or is it just in Denmark? Anybody know? Was it in Denmark?
That was in Belgium, but
it was in Belgium. It was in Belgium. Belgium just outlawed Shlita, just outlawed kosher slaughter. And so it's a real big challenge. I mean, so these are, now you have to understand that there is no, whatever. I mean, Europe's a whole different thing. There's no separation of church and state there. There's no freedom of religion doesn't exist in Europe the same way it does in America. There's a whole different system there. But the point is, that's a crazy thing right now that Shlita just got outlawed. Kosher slaughter just got outlawed in Belgium. Keep in mind, and this is a whole different discussion on a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is animal cruelty. Keep in mind that the greatest pain to animals right now has nothing to do with how they're slaughtered. Anybody know what the greatest pain to animals is right now? The rest of their lives. That's the biggest problem right now with the animal industry. So the irony is that they're honing in on the last 3 seconds of their lives, when the real problem with the modern factory farming industry is the fact of how they're raised for every single other moment of their lives. Now that has not been outlawed. So, all right, I think it shows, I think, what I think some of the motivations are, and they're not purely ethical.
What do they have against kosher slaughter?
Well, they want every animal to be what do they call it? Where you stun them first.
What?
They want them to be stunned first so that they don't feel any pain.
Oh.
Yeah. Now it happens to be some kosher slaughterers do that. It's a question in the Jewish literature. Are you allowed to stun an animal before slaughtering it? Now that's a whole different discussion about the nature of kosher slaughter and how you cut the esophagus and the trachea, and that's where the oxygen goes to the brain, and that's in our brain. Of course, pain is just your brain sending signals to your body. So if you sever the connection between the brain and the body, pain ceases. That's a whole different discussion about how kosher slaughter actually is a very humane process. But that's for another day. But the point is there a point where even if the law of the land is the law, Jewishly, to a point, back in the days of the Maccabees when they said you can't study Torah, so that's where the Dreidels came in, right? With the rabbis with the little kids learning Torah, when the authorities would come around, they would yell to the kids, "Put away the chumash and take out your Dreidels." That way they'll just think we're playing a nice, friendly game of Dreidel for 8 hours a day. So that's what they would do. But, all right, so that's the question of the night. Any other thoughts on civil disobedience before we take a look at the Parsha and see where our Parsha addresses it?
Yogi?
Yes.
It's more important that you know and I know that the person is lying. You cannot just say we need to be with God, but if the person is lying, where is you give the line? You put the line.
You're saying like you have to know what God wants? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm just saying it's a lot, like Trump, but even Jewish religious, sometimes they lie. And
I don't believe it.
yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. Listen, as I always say, everybody's human. Everybody's human.
No, but Trump, we know that half of the time or more, he was just not telling the truth.
Yeah, so I don't want to get so much into the politics here, whether you're right or wrong, just because I try to stay politically out of it. But yeah, I do understand your point, Bracha. I understand your point. So
Thank you.
So Leah, here is what I want to throw out to you, and this is what I want to throw out to everybody out there in the Torah crowd. We got a beautiful Torah crowd tonight, and that is this: what Leah Ullman said tonight. That isn't it obvious that there are different levels of authority? That the government is one level of authority, but let's say God is a higher level of authority, and of course you should follow that when the two conflict. That is an incredibly controversial statement throughout most of history. This idea that to you, Leah, is so obvious throughout most of history would have potentially been considered blasphemous. To say that there's anything higher than the king is blasphemous. There was a law in Europe. Anybody know the law? Or I guess I don't know if it's really a law. I guess it was a political theory. Where do we know in Europe that if you went against the king, it was heresy? It was actually, this was during the Middle Ages in Europe. It was called the divine right of kings. What's that?
That he was appointed by God.
Yeah, it was essentially this idea that the kings were God's messengers on earth, and that it didn't matter what the king said, whether seemingly right or wrong, they were God's emissaries, and therefore to go against the king is to go against God Almighty. And therefore, throughout much of human history, there has been no distinction between different tiers of authority. There is just king, just Pharaoh, just God. They're one and the same. So what we're going to talk about tonight, which I think for many of you seems so obvious that there are different tiers of authority, this is an incredibly innovative statement that the Torah is about to make, that the king or the ruler and God are not the same, and they don't have equal say. This is a revolutionary concept in the Torah. Now, I've been sharing with many of you, because I've been so enjoying it, this wonderful book from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, his last book that came out before his recent passing, called Judaism's Life-Changing Ideas. This idea that I'm going to share with you tonight is actually not based in this book. It's based in a different book that he wrote called Covenant and Conversation. But this book talks about every week's Parsha and a revolutionary moral idea that came from that week's Parsha. So amazing. If you have not bought this book, go out on Amazon and buy Judaism's Life-Changing Ideas, folks. You will thank me later. So anyways, let's take a look at this week's Parsha. Here we go. Here we go, folks. We're going to get into the meat and patooties. All right. Here we go. The Jews are enslaved. Here we go, folks. We're right at the beginning, chapter 1 of Exodus, right here. Verse 14, 13, so the Egyptians enslaved the children of Israel with back-breaking labor, and they embittered their lives with hard labor, with clay and with bricks, and with all kinds of labor in the fields, all of the work that they were worked with back-breaking labor. Now the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. Now I want you to notice the language here, and remember, you've maybe learned this 100 times, but I promise you, look at it with fresh eyes and you will see something new tonight. Look at it very carefully. Now, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, who one was named Shifra, my wife's name, and the second who was named Pua, thankfully not my wife's name. All right. So Shifra and Pua, although I always think it would have been funny if it was Yogi and Poo. That would have actually been quite funny. So here we go. Shifra and Pua are these Hebrew midwives, and listen to what Pharaoh tells them. And he said, verse 16, when you deliver the Hebrew women and you see on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, she may live. This is the original Hitler-like figure in Jewish history. Genocide. We're going to kill all the baby boys, lest they potentially rise up against us, because the Jews are getting they're multiplying too much, and they're Semitic people and we're Egyptian people, and who knows which side they're going to take if a war comes our way. So let's just kill out all the men who are going to be the future warriors. All right. So look at verse 17, and this is the highlighted verse of tonight that deals with civil disobedience. The midwives, however, feared God. Notice how it doesn't say feared Pharaoh, who at that time was seen as a deity. So they did not do as the king of Egypt had spoken to them. And notice how the Torah, remember, it's always there trying to educate us about moral values. Notice how it very clearly, so that there's no misunderstanding in the reader's eyes. Who did the midwives fear? God. And because they feared God, who did they not listen to? The king of Egypt. Now, I know that sounds like a simple verse, but that's actually incredibly revolutionary. The Torah is making the first distinction that you find between a ruler and God. And it's saying the midwives actually feared God, not the king. The implication being the king is not God. Now, again, this sounds so obvious to us nowadays, but the Torah is drawing a line in the sand, which is actually very, very important. So they didn't listen to the king of Egypt as he had spoken to them, but they enabled the boys to live. So the baby boys came out. They came out. They probably gave him a little bris milah. Bada bing, bada boom. Here's another Jewish yingle, and on we go. Verse 18, so the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing that you have enabled the boys to live? And here, I love this line. See, Jews have never been really known for our athletics, but these midwives seem to disagree. We've lost our athletic genes. Look at this. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are skilled as midwives. When the midwife has not yet come, they've already given birth. They're fast. I mean, they can pop out babies like nothing. We try to come and get them. By the time, they come, the pie's out of the oven. We can't do anything about it. These are Olympic athletes. So,
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
This is confusing.
And hold on, Leah. I want to hear your question, but let me just read one last verse so we can finish this part. And then verse 21, now it took place when the midwives feared God that he made houses for them. So there's some kind of reward that they get. And so Pharaoh commanded all his people. So now he says, all right, I can't rely on the midwives. I'm just going to tell everybody, every son who is born, you shall cast the Nile, and every daughter you shall allow to live. And so, Leah, we're going to get to your question in just a moment. But what's important to know, and I think this is so interesting, this is the very first time that there is a documented incident of civil disobedience in human history. This is the very first written incident of civil disobedience. How many of you knew that? Raise your hand if you knew this was the very first documented case of civil disobedience in all of human history. If you did, that's very interesting. If you didn't, it's pretty amazing. And so the Torah is sharing this with us, and this is revolutionary. This is knock your socks off territory. Very first case in all of written human history of civil disobedience. Shifra and Pua, letting the Jewish babies live and not listening to Pharaoh. Leah.
Are the midwives Jewish or not?
Oh, Leah, with the question of the day.
Thank you.
You get a round of applause. Okay, this is actually what I was hoping you guys would notice. Good job. I always assumed they were Jewish. You know why I assumed they were Jewish?
Because
Anybody know?
God. Because they said they feared God.
Well, okay. I would assume that other people could potentially fear God, but I hear you. Certainly the Jews you would expect to fear God. But there's something even more simple. Look at verse 15. What do you see? Read the verse carefully and tell me what you see.
Hebrew midwives.
I'll show you the Hebrew, so if you want to see the Hebrew. Here is Vayomer Tetzayin. You can look at it in 16 too. Vayomer beyaledchen et ha'ivriot riten halavnaim. Tedvav, previous verse. Vayomer melech Mitzrayim, and here's the key words. La miyaldot ha'ivriot. All right, for those Hebrew speakers here, how would you translate La miyaldot ha'ivriot?
The Jewish midwives.
All right, does everybody agree with that?
Or it could be translated as the midwives to the Jewish women.
Right, that's right. So it's very ambiguous. It could be la mialdot ha'ivriot, meaning the word ivriot goes on the mialdot, goes on the midwives, meaning who were these midwives? Jewish midwives, or it could be La Mialdota Ivriot, the midwives to the Jews, the Jews' midwives. So potentially these could actually be Egyptians. And that even makes this even more revolutionary. Because if it's a Jewish midwife, okay, it's certainly still revolutionary, but it's their own people. And maybe they were sympathetic to, I don't know, who knows what. It doesn't seem as certainly as wild. It's still wild, but it's not as wild. But imagine if Shifra and Pua are just your regular Egyptian kiddos. Well, they're not kids, but a regular Egyptian Joanne and Josephine. And they are not listening to their own kind, their own king, their Egyptian brother. That makes it even more interesting. And the Torah leaves it to us as a completely ambiguous text. Now, traditionally, who have we said that Shifra and Pua were?
Was one of them Miriam?
Yeah, so I'm going to show you Rashi now. Here we go to this wonderful thing on the Chabad website, which is why I love using it. So now we can do show Rashi. Rashi says over here, who were these women, Shifra and Pua? Take a look in the yellow box here. Shifra, this was Yocheved. Yocheved is, by the way, who?
Moses' mother.
Moses' mother. Miriam's mother and Aaron's mother as well. This was Yocheved because she beautified, which is the word mishaperet, the newborn infant. So not only did she not kill the babies, but she put some Revlon, cream on them too. Put a little L'Oreal on the baby. So that was Shifra, mishaperet tavlad. She would beautify them. And who is Pua? This was Miriam, Yocheved's daughter, Moses' older sister. But why was she called Pua? Because she cried, which is the word Pua, and talked and cooed. Pua is the word coo in English. To the newborn infant in the manner of women who soothe a crying infant, where they say poo, poo, poo. See, you guys thought this was a modern Jewish phrase. It goes all the way back to Pua, who was the first woman to say poo, poo, poo. This is Shifra and Pua. So according to the sages of the Talmud, Shifra and Pua are nicknames, like Yogi for Yochai is Shifra is Yocheved and Pua is Miriam. But, and this is the big but, the text of the Torah is not so clear. And there's ample room there to suggest that these people's names were Shifra and Pua. And maybe they were Jewish or maybe they weren't. And here's why I think that's so interesting. And this is a point that Rabbi Sachs makes in his book, Covenant and Conversation, that what were they doing is standing up for what we would call now, many, many thousands of years later, going through many, many political evolutions and refinements, we would call this universal human rights, that you should not kill an innocent person. To us, doesn't seem novel, but throughout much of human history was incredibly novel. The idea that an individual has a right. Individuals don't have rights. No such thing as human rights. The king gets to do with you whatever he wants. So this idea that everyone has a human right and that this is a universal human right, that an Egyptian as well as a Jew should keep these kind of laws. This would not be unique to Jews. This is all humanity should recognize that there are some things. And I want to show you a quote from Henry David Thoreau, which is a very beautiful quote on a book he wrote called Civil Disobedience. But Henry David Thoreau only lived, when did he live, in the 1700s? And when he wrote Civil Disobedience, it was, a very shocking idea that there are times where it's appropriate not to listen to authorities. But thousands of years before Henry David Thoreau, you have Shifra and Pua saying there are certain things which are immoral that we cannot. It's actually moral to be disobedient. It's the right thing to be. You are actually being obedient to God by being disobedient to government.
Wait, excuse me. We didn't even have the 10 Commandments yet. How did they know what God thought was okay and what he didn't think it was okay.
Well, they did have the 7 Noahide laws. They did have the 7 Noahide laws, of one of them being do not murder.
But how'd they get them?
All right, that's a different discussion about how were the 7 Noahide laws passed down.
Okay.
You might call them, trying to think what they call them. In modern American political thought, they call it, what do they call it?
Basic human rights.
No. It's called, I just had it and then I lost it. But it essentially is morality, which is just common sense. They call it
Called natural morality.
Natural morality. Thank you. So, yeah.
The term, and this is what the term fear of God is very much clear that that's what they're talking about here. Fear of God is natural morality. And it's actually interesting that Rashi makes this incredible leap to even suggest that they were Jewish, where everything else about the story indicates otherwise.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So what would lead you to believe that they're not Jewish?
Well, first of all, that if they were Jewish, then they wouldn't have to say that, it wouldn't have to point out they had fear of God, because the assumption would be that they already have it. Secondly, you would not assume that Pharaoh was ordering around Jewish midwives. And you wouldn't assume that Jewish midwives would even carry out killing their own people. So you would assume that a Egyptian midwife would do exactly as Pharaoh orders. So it's interesting that Rashi goes to, I think, an opposite extreme, but in my opinion, that is only just reflecting the fact that you don't want to give non-Jews a credit for having natural morality.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting point. It happens to be, it's interesting. I've been actually doing a lot of thinking with some of my colleagues about this question, about thinking about how does the Torah and later commentaries think about non-Jews and morality. I actually had a long discussion with one of the biggest rabbis in the country about this very question just last week. Really very animated discussion that I had about this very topic, which maybe we'll go into at some future date. But yeah, that's a very interesting point. I can't speak to Rashi's motives. I hear what you're saying. But yeah, I think Rav Shmuel Luzzatto, so even before my father, very wise man, even before my dad, there was a man named Rav Shmuel Luzzatto, who is an Italian commentator, who makes this very point. Can you imagine Pharaoh putting Jewish midwives in charge of killing Jewish babies? Does that sound sensical? If you were Pharaoh, would you entrust Jewish women to do such a task? Most likely not. You would put what's an Egyptian name? I don't know. Give me an Egyptian name, folks.
Tutankhamun.
Tutankhamunet. Wyatt, you look like you know Egyptian names. What do you got for me? What's an Egyptian name for a woman?
Oh, I have no idea.
Cleopatra. I don't know. You'd put Cleopatra in charge. You're not going to put Sprinza. You're not going to put Sprinza and Bracha in charge of killing the babies. And so this, Rav Shmuel Luzzatto argues, is exactly what happens here. Now, by the way, very interesting question over here. And Abba, this would be an interesting thing for you to think about. God, he rewards the midwives in verse 20. It says, God benefited the midwives and they multiplied, they became very strong. Oh, sorry, the people became strong. Look in verse 21. Now it took place when the midwives feared God that he made houses for them. Houses for them. So now this is interesting. What kind of a reward is a house? So like, is this like the lotto? You did good, I'm buying you a house. What do you think it means that, and I'll let you see the Hebrew if you want to see the Hebrew as well. He gifts them houses. What do you think? What do you think, folks? What's the meaning behind this of houses? Why is that the right reward for sparing the boys?
The melucha.
Oh, the menucha?
Melucha.
Oh, melucha.
The kingship.
Oh, Chaya, you're on with us. I didn't even
I
see your
just
name.
joined.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you. Okay, you're saying the melucha. So kingship. So who got melucha? Who got kingship?
Shifra.
Okay.
David HaMelech.
Okay, you're saying great Jewish kings came from these people? Okay.
Yeah.
Chaya is a reader of Rashi, as we know. So even though I didn't show Rashi, Chaya is like a walking Rashi.
No.
Okay, we'll take a look at Rashi in a minute. But what do you think the simple meaning is? Anybody have a guess? And why would it be appropriate to gift houses? It's like the sweepstakes over here. You get a house, you get a house. What's going on here? Why do they get houses?
Protect themselves.
Oh, that's interesting. To protect themselves from Pharaoh. That's interesting. I've actually never thought about that.
A house is a castle. It's our castle.
That's very interesting. So it's like a protection from people that might want to harm them. That's good. Good answer. Any other thoughts?
Isn't the term house also used as the family of, the descendants of, from the house of somebody?
Yeah.
Not a physical house, but the house being descendants.
Yes.
Family.
Yes, very good. So Rav Shmuel Litzato, the same one who I just said suggests that these are Egyptian women. He actually says over here, you know why God gave them houses? Because houses means children. He gave them generations. He gave them houses and families. He says because historically, you know who the midwives were? Barren women. This was a field that barren women would go into. You didn't have your own children, so you would help to bring other children into the world. And so mida keneged mida, measure for measure, God says, you help babies come into the world, I will give you your own batim. I will give you your own families, your own children. I think it's a very beautiful interpretation as well. Now I'll show you Rashi, and Rashi is, of course, going along with his prior statement about who Shifra and Pua is. So Rashi says, what is houses? He says the houses of priesthood, the Levitic family, that's the house of priesthood, and the royal family, which are called houses, as it is written, and he built the house of the Lord and the house of the king. So he says these are not physical houses or even genetic houses. These are institutions. These are the royal institution and the Levitic priestly institution, because we know that through Moses and Aaron is going to come the priests, and through Miriam will come the kings, the royal family. So that's Rashi's interpretation. Of course, it goes along with his previous interpretation. Now, I do want to show you Henry David Thoreau's statement, which I love. I pulled it up here. You can see he looks like a regular Hasidic guy, Henry David Thoreau. He's just missing some payas. But this is a really beautiful statement from Henry David Thoreau. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison, the only house in a slave state in which a free man can abide with honor. It's a really beautiful line from Henry David Thoreau. And this is from his book, Civil Disobedience. And this basically says it. There's a time where if your government is doing evil, you have to stand in opposition to it. Hitler was rose to power under a democratic system of governance as well. You would hope that people would have protested in the most strong way when he came to power. Of course, they didn't, or at least not in masses. So this is Henry David Thoreau. But what we're seeing tonight, folks, in Shifra and Pua is Henry David Thoreau in action thousands of years before Henry David Thoreau would publicize this idea. Now, Henry David Thoreau would become the inspiration for the abolitionist movement to get rid of slavery. He was certainly an inspiration for the civil rights movement. But you could have looked just as much to Shifra and Pua as inspirations. And by the way, when you look at all the black slave songs, they do find solace in the stories of Exodus. And that's why Let My People Go. And the whole story of Exodus is I would say probably where Henry David Thoreau gets it from in many ways, whether he understood it or not, which is this idea of God turning down to a Pharaoh and saying, you think these are your people to do whatever you want with? No, they're my people. Let my people go. Emphasis on mine, my people, not your people. And so this is a very, very powerful statement. So, I guess I've had a lot of conversations with people about why the Torah is so important in terms of these revolutionary ideas. One of the great problems that we have as being Western people is that Western society has adopted many Judaic ideas as just part of their regular Weltanschauung. It's just part of our culture, And so at this point, we don't see it as novel. But the reality is that, John Locke and all of his political theories about human rights and theories of liberty and social contract and all those kind of things, John Locke only comes around in the 17th century. So, these are concepts that have not been around for so long in the regular world, but in the Judaic world, in the biblical world, they're the ones who are bringing these concepts to light. Okay, John Locke is the one who maybe spreads it to Western civilization, but the roots of John Locke, of individual freedom and social contract and human rights, are rooted in Tselem Elohim and man being created in the image of God. These are biblical concepts. Yeah.
Excuse me, Joe, but something I find a little disturbing. As far as civil disobedience, if a group believes that they're answering to a higher moral authority.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Like the protesters, they felt they were doing right.
Yeah.
In that case, who's to determine what's right and what's wrong?
Yeah, I mean, that is ultimately the question of all questions, Leah. Because for every person who would say this person's right, there's another person saying what you're doing is wrong. Which is why it's so important that we become as best acquainted as we can with I think, Torah, which can be our guide for morality. And even within Torah, there are so many different opinions that you've got to be very, very careful in how you do that. Are you picking and choosing? And it is complex. I don't deny.
How would you use Torah to decide right and wrong from what happened today?
Specifically today?
Yeah.
So that's a very good question. I'm gonna throw it to the audience first. What are you guys thinking?
The answer is not in Torah. The question is, what is the nature of government, and do the people have an avenue for redress? In America, they do. And as such, what happened today was unlawful and disgraceful. When you can redress the issues there, then you go through the process that allows you to do that.
Oh, but I'm sorry, and I'm not justifying what happened today, except that I would imagine they thought they had tried to redress the issue and they weren't successful in the way that they did it. And so they went to the next level of what I guess they would consider redress.
Well, you know what? At a certain point, you have to accept the fact that people are totally disengaged from reality.
Well, but Rabbi Yogi said, and I agree with him, that no one, sort of comes to work and thinks I'm going to do really bad job or illegal job, right? These people think they're right. They're freedom fighters. So to someone, to one group of people, they're freedom fighters. To another, they're murderers, and they're
Yeah, and that's why they say that.
As I said before, as long as they are not liars.
Yeah, but this is why they say, and it's not actually
it's not all this truth. It's Hitler also. He did some terrible thing. It wasn't. Yeah, if you are willing to kill somebody to get to power, so it's not straightforward.
Yeah, no, and I understand what everyone's saying. And this is why people say, even though it's not linguistically true, but they say history is short for his story. Whoever gets to write it gets to sort of share their narrative of what's real and what was good and what was bad. That's not actually linguistically where it comes from, but it is a cute idea, and it is true. But listen, in the end of the day, it's really not a question for civil disobedience. The question of how do you know what you're doing is right or wrong is a question for every day. Civil disobedience just happens to be one example, which is in the public arena. But we should be equally concerned with this question, how do I know that I'm living right? Every single day, we should have the same concern. Civil disobedience is just on the public stage. But the reality is, for people who care, this is a question that we're struggling with every day. And hopefully, I mean, the goal of learning Torah is the goal of trying to strip away our biases, trying to fill ourselves with, we'll call it divine light or wisdom, and to try to push away many of our sort of human, our lower elements, to try to reveal our higher elements. And through that, hopefully we get closer to walking the walk. But it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. Listen, even amongst the Jewish world, you've got 1,000 opinions. I'm not saying it's easy. But I do think that if we try really, really hard, we are able to distinguish generally between that which is right and that which is wrong. Not always. It's certainly not easy. And by the way, the Torah says something which I think is so beautiful also. There, after all of the 613 commandments, really this is one of the 613, but after 612, the Torah says, Vasita hatov ha'yashar b'nei Hashem, which means do the right thing, essentially, if you had to translate it into modern lingo. Do that which is straight and righteous, which is saying I cannot give you a law for every single scenario that will ever happen in human history. I can't give you a law for that. Take my Torah, use it as precedent, study both the law and the spirit to understand how would you be able to interpret it to future scenarios that I haven't addressed. I do want to show you, because our time is really, really limited. We only have 3 minutes left. One of my favorite commentaries, and I only learned it for the first time in 2017, and that is a beautiful statement by Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, not the typical Soloveitchiks that you'll ever hear from, Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik. And here we have, what a great way to sort of end the class. There's so much more that we could talk about tonight, but look at this verse over here. This is the beginning of Shifra and Pua, the Song of the Sea. And look at I don't know if you've ever noticed this, folks, but look at the language here. The very first line of Shifra and Pua, which I'm destroying here. Hold on. Yeah. Okay. There we go. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang the song to the Lord, and they spoke, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for very exalted is he. A horse and its rider he cast into the sea. So this is the splitting of the sea. The Jews go through, the Egyptian gets stuck and get killed. You ever wonder why the emphasis on Mr. Ed? Folks, it's the Egyptians we care about getting killed here, the enemies. Why are we focused on Mr. Ed dying here in the sea? The horse and its rider are cast into the sea. So there's a very, very beautiful book on the Parsha, which I spent 2017, every week I would read his essays on the Parsha, and it's highly recommended. It's called The Person in the Parsha by Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb. He's a psychologist as well as a rabbi. Wonderful, wonderful book. And he writes there in his one of his essays on B'Shalach, which is the Parsha that the Shifra Yam comes out on. And Rav Aaron Soloveitchik says something so beautiful. Torah always associate horses with what? What are horses always symbolic of? Anybody know?
I would say war.
Okay, war or power.
Or king.
Kings.
Well, the kings are told in Jewish law, you should not lo yarbes susim. You shouldn't have too many horses. In other words, you got to be careful about how much power you have, lest you abuse it. Horses, there's a reason they call it horsepower. Horses were always seen as might. And what horses represented when they were drowned is not only were the Egyptians drowned, but their whole philosophy of might makes right, that gets drowned too. What a beautiful commentary. So the horses represent might. It's not just the Egyptians that gets drowned, it's their entire philosophy, which propped up their entire system, that gets drowned too. The might makes right. No. Might does not make right. There is a higher authority, and therefore the horses get drowned too. your entire philosophy gets killed along with you yourselves. So the idea that we see in this week's Parsha, which is an incredibly revolutionary idea, is that there are tiers of authority, and that God is above government. And then, of course, government is generally above man unless it contradicts God. I will just end, with a statement in Kedushin. This is a piece of Talmud in Kedushin. It's on page 42b, if you want to look into it later. I don't want to really go into the specific subject that it's discussing here about shliach ledvar avera. Can you have a messenger to do a sin for you? It's an interesting subject. But look at what it says over here. He says there is no agency for transgression, for as we say, when there is a conflict between the words of the master, i.e. God, and the words of the student, i.e. a human being, whose words should be listened to? And this is essentially the Talmudic way of phrasing what I'm saying. Divrei harav v'divrei hatalmud, divrei mishomim. Who do you listen to? You listen to the Rav or you listen to the Talmud? And that's essentially saying government is called Talmud, the student, Rav is called God, God is the rabbi. And who do you listen to? So whenever there's a conflict, this is what you want to use as as how you're going to make decisions. By the way, the Talmud addresses this as well to cases where we have problems. What if you have a parent who tells you to sin? You have a parent who says, go steal me something. Do you have to listen to them? You have a mitzvah to honor your parents. You have to listen to them. And upon that too, the Talmud says, Divrei harav, Divrei hatalmud, Divrei mishomin. Who do you listen to? You listen to the student or the master. Your parents, they're your parents, but they're still a student of God. So therefore God's word comes first. Do not steal takes precedence over honor your father and mother. So this is true with government as well. So that's really the idea that I want to share with you tonight. We don't have time to really go into another really cool concept, which is about how in Jewish Nach, in Navi, you find that simultaneously with the institutionalism, I'm not getting the right word out, with the institutions of power come all of the checks and balances on power, which is the prophets. The prophets who are there to criticize the kings come at the exact same time where the kings are propped up in Jewish history. Because again, it's the same thing. The king needs to always know that he's being checked. So in Jewish history, if you learn Tanakh, you'll see that with Shaul and David, you have Natan Hanavi. Nathan comes and criticizes David. You don't have that in European monarchies. They don't have a prophet there ready to criticize. But in Judaism, we understand the king is not the highest authority. The king needs a prophet on top of him. So there's a lot to say about this. But what we are seeing here is Shifra and Pua, whoever they were, whether it's Miriam Yocheved, whether it's Shifra and Pua, some Egyptian ladies who end up with either really nice fortresses or children. And they understand there's a point. There's a point where it's appropriate, like Henry David Thoreau says, to go against government when government is doing evil. So how that relates to today, as you know, I use today as a little bit, I don't want to say it's a bait and switch. It's not a bait and switch. We are discussing it, but I never discuss, politics too much, just because we try to make sure everybody is on happy terms. But I did mention that I think there are certain things today which are beyond politics, and that's why I addressed it. So any thoughts, questions, comments?